A very good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, evening, morning. And before we start or welcome the main speaker of today's session, I would like to give a few housekeeping tips as usual. The orange arrow opens and closes your control panel. So please, for more view, you can use that. You can change your audio option from your computer to your phone anytime that you want. All the audience's microphones will be muted. So if you have any questions, please use the questions tab. And at the end of the session, we will take up all of those questions. This session is recorded. All the previous recordings are available on YouTube. We will share those links as well. And everybody will be receiving a participation certificate, after the session has ended. And like I said, if you have any questions, please do submit them in the questions tab and we will be taking them at the end. I would now like to invite Professor Devasiri to please introduce today's speaker.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you all to the 7th session of the Research Mentoring Program, which is conducted as an extension of the Writing Impactful Research Program and also post-conference engagement of the ICMR 2021, conducted by the Faculty of Management Studies, Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, in collaboration with Emerald Publishing and Gulf Medical University, Ajman, UAE. With great respect, let me first welcome the main speaker of today's session, Professor Shanthi Gopalakrishnan, Martin Tuchman School of Management. Today, she is delivering the topic, Writing the Abstract and Reconciling the References of Your Manuscript. With gratitude, let me also welcome Professor Atula Jnanapala, Dean, Faculty of Management Studies at the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. Then with gratitude, let me also welcome Ms. Sangeeta Menon, Publishing Relationship Manager at Emerald Publishing, Professor Sudhir Rana, Gulf Medical University. Then with gratitude, let me also welcome Ms. Disha Lakhanpal, Regional Marketing Manager, Emerald Publishing Group. Then with great respect, I would like to welcome all the distinguished participants from Emerald Publishing, Gulf Medical University and Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. At last but not least, the respected audience, mainly our academics from all over the world, senior professors, senior lecturers, students and researchers are welcome to the program for making this session lively. Now I would like to introduce the main speaker of today's session, and it is a great pleasure for me to announce her. Professor Shanthi Gopalakrishnan completed her undergraduate and graduate work in India and worked with a customer durable company. Then she obtained her PhD at Rutgers University, and she is currently a professor at the Martin Tuchman School of Management, USA. She is also the editor-in-chief of the South Asian Journal of Business Studies and serves on the editorial boards of several journals. Professor Shanthi Gopalakrishnan, Madam, here onwards, platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Devasiri. It is an honor to be part of the Emerald series, and thank you for inviting me to be the penultimate speaker in this series. I am delighted to talk to all of you today about writing an abstract and how to reconcile the references in your manuscript. I think you've gone through 6 very, very good workshops to make you very adept researchers and publishers, and I hope that this will help the process. As you know, and as I've been introduced, I wear many hats. I'm the Associate Dean at the Martin Tuchman School of Management. I'm also a professor and I teach classes. I'm the editor of the South Asian Journal, and I have been for about 6 years. I am also an author, like all of you, who still continues to submit manuscripts to journals. I get probably 50% of them rejected and perhaps 50% of them accepted. And I think our whole journey as an academic is how to improve our acceptance rate. And I think over time, we get better at dealing with reviewers and editors and being better able to co-opt them into the process. So today what I'm going to speak to you about is how to help you perhaps in that journey and in that process. So the presentation today is going to be in 4 parts. Professor Devasri was very, I sent him my slides and he said, you cannot spend most of your time pitching the journal. And I respect that completely. Yet I'm going to tell you briefly in a slide or two about my journal, and then go on to the topic that we are going to be discussing today, which is writing the abstract and how to build your references. And I'm also going to sort of close with some general tips for publishing. So the next slide, please. Diksha, can we go to the next slide? So the South Asian Journal of Business Studies has been in existence for about 12 years, and it is primarily covers the area of South Asia. We cover broad areas like entrepreneurship, global and social responsibility, which is now popularly called EGS, business developments, marketing, organization behavior, theory, strategy, and also finance, economics, and international trade. We are ranked by ABDC. We are completely digital, and we are in the 12th volume this year. And what is interesting is we started originally with 2 issues per volume. We moved to 3, and now we have 4 issues a volume, and we still have a waiting period of almost a year to get published. So once your paper is accepted, you're part of the early Cite, where people can see your research and people can cite you, but it's not officially published. So you have a longer window that you're out there. And also just this week, we've launched our LinkedIn page. So if you're interested, please follow us on our LinkedIn page. Next slide. So what is South Asia? South Asia really consists of 7 countries, which is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan, and Bhutan. So if you live in any one of these countries, or your data comes from any one of these countries, we are a perfect match for you. And also, if you do comparative studies with either any other Asian country or European country or the Americas with one of the South Asian countries and feature the comparison, we are the journal for you. So make sure that you fit the scope of the journal, and if you do, feel free to submit. I want to talk a little bit about the competitive landscape of journals and what it is that you are facing when you publish. So next slide. So there are many, many, many journals out there. And the important thing is, once we have done our research, we have to be able to pick or select the journal where we want to publish in. And I think this is a very, very, it needs a little bit of skill, and also it needs a little bit, with experience, you get better. We often aspire for the best journal, and sometimes that is not the perfect strategy. So over time, you get experienced in knowing what kind of journal is likely to publish your research. But before we do that, we essentially have to evaluate journals, and there are several metrics that you can use to evaluate journals. The first one is what is called JCR, or Journal Citation Reports. Typically, this provides impact factors of journals. And these are, most older journals have a JCR, and the impact factor is basically computed by looking at how often and how frequently papers in that journal are referenced by other papers. And some of the top journals in our field, like Academy of Management Journal, Administrative Science Quarterly, in the field of management, or Strategic Management Journal, have impact factors somewhere in the range of 8 to 11. Our journal, a lot of the newer journals have to work to get a journal citation report score. So in the absence of that, you look to see whether journals are ranked by ABDC, which is the Australian Business Deans Council list. and they rank journals as A star, A, B, and C. And obviously the A stars are the most difficult to get published in, and B and C are easier. But even the B and C are not easy journals to get published in, because the number of people trying to publish relative to the space that the journals have is, the ratio is very high. So you have to really work at getting papers published. And the last one that evaluates journals is Scopus. So just to, there are many, I've just given the Asia focused journals on the right, which is the Asia Pacific Journal of Management, the Asia Pacific Journal of Human Resources, and so on. And South Asian Journal of Business Studies, one of the metrics by which you evaluate if a journal is doing well is to see what is happening to its Scopus scores. And we have consistently been improving by fairly large leaps in our Scopus scoring. And as of 2022, our Scopus score was 4.6, and our number of downloads, that is people looking for papers that might be relevant to their research, went up by 46%. So oftentimes I would urge you to make sure that you find the right journal, make sure that your paper fits the scope of the journal, and then send it out to the journal. So having said that, I'm going to move to the sort of set the stage for the topic that we're going to talk today, and which is writing an abstract. No, can we go back, please? Yes. So what is writing an abstract? I want you to think of an abstract as a kind of elevator pitch for your paper. What is an elevator pitch? If you met the CEO of a company when you're in an elevator and you had 1 minute to make a pitch about why the company should hire you, what is it that you would tell the CEO about yourself? In other words, the abstract is essentially how you showcase your article or manuscript to the journal, to the readers, to the reviewers. So what is the role of an abstract? Broadly, I would say the abstract has 3 roles, okay? One is to communicate the key findings and the key, what the paper is trying to do to the readers, the reviewers, and so on. Second, what is the relevance of this paper to the research community? And 3, your abstract has to be written in such a way that it whets the appetite of the reader, the reviewers, saying, hey, I just don't want to read the abstract. I want to read the whole paper. I want to read the findings. So you have to write it in a way, not in a boring, unenthusiastic way, but you have to write it truthfully, but with enthusiasm, so that the reader wants to read more. Having said that, how do you write the abstract? What are the keys to writing the abstract? So let's go to the next slide. I am borrowing this from Thatcher and Fisher, 2022. It's a wonderful piece in the Academy of Management Review. And they basically say that there are 5 C's to writing a good, interesting abstract. And the 5 C's are common ground, complication, concern, course of action, and contribution. So I'm going to sort of use a paper that I have recently published in South Asian Journal of Business Studies to try and answer these 5 C's, right? So the first one is common ground. So typically for the common ground, you try to start saying, what do we know from previous research? So we published a paper about how social connections impact the survival of startup firms, and how that is the impact is different from the USA and India. So the common ground that we started with was that social connections are important for entrepreneurial survival, right? So what is the complication in the research? The complication is countries have different kinds of institutions. have different kinds of national cultures. People are in fact different, and therefore the way social connections can impact survival can indeed be different in different countries. So the concern is, therefore, should this difference impact survival differently? And the way we looked at it is, should this difference affect survival differently in different stages of an entrepreneurial firm? So the course of action, we chose to use secondary published data and use an empirical study to address it. And our contribution is a lot of the hypotheses that we expected, that social connections affect firms differently. So they're more important in early stages in India, and they're more important for later stages for survival in India. And we were able to prove it empirically. So bottom line is, you have to show where you're coming from, what is the gap that you're addressing, how what you're doing makes sense in this context. How are you going to do your study? Are you using survey data? Are you using secondary data? What are some of the key findings and takeaways from your research? And you have to write it in a way that when most people read abstracts to figure out, do they want to read the study? Do they want to download the study? Do they want to read it fully? Because we don't have time to read every study. So you have to present it in a way that people feel that they want to read the study. Next. Next slide, please. So the next thing is the format of the abstract. Most journals have formats for the abstract. In fact, I desk reject, I'd say 10% of papers because they don't follow the format. What people do is they get a paper rejected from a previous journal, just turn it around and send it to the next journal without bothering to see what the requirements for the journal that they are sending the paper to. Even I am guilty of this mistake. So sometimes you have to make sure you go through what the journal says in terms of requirements for the abstract, for the references, and make sure you follow that when you send in the paper. So as I said before, you have to, I'm going to go through what some formats are and what you need to do to follow the format. In addition, below the abstract, you have something called the keywords. And one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is, the whole purpose of research is, we as authors and researchers want to increase our impact. We want to make sure that other people read our research and cite us. How do you think that happens? It's almost a strategy. One is that you have to create keywords for your research that are broad-based, and people will search looking for that area of research. So you can't be very, very narrow and niche-based. So let's say you're doing an innovation research. It's better to say innovation than to say product improvements in manufacturing. It's very unlikely that product improvements in manufacturing, somebody is going to look for that. They're going to first start with a sort of broadest way of looking for it. So one of the ways you need to get your research out there and visible is to pick sort of broad-based keywords. Now, most journals, in fact, give you the list of keywords based on which you need to pick. So it is not of your choosing, but some of the younger journals allow you to list the keywords that you want to use. These keywords both decide whether people are going to see your article or manuscript, and also decide who the reviewers might be. So it is very, very important that you pick these aptly based on who you think you might want your paper to go to. Next slide, Diksha. So I'm going to tell you how not to write an abstract, right? Some of the common mistakes. So this is an example of an abstract that we got in our journal. And if you do an abstract in the wrong format, that is the easiest way to get rejected. I mean, you might have a fantastic paper with great data, great results, but if you don't follow the format, the editor is not going to go beyond looking at the first page of your journal. So what are some common mistakes that authors make? One is that you don't follow the format. So if the journal has a format, Emerald has a format, and I'm going to share that format with you, but not following the format is the first common mistake. So you send it to some other journal, they reject it, then you just take the same paper without looking to see what the new journal's format is and send it out to them. That's the first mistake. The second is not paraphrasing your work. So in other words, an abstract should look, no, can we go back to the abstract should look to summarize your research, right? The third is many abstracts are the first paragraph or the introduction to your to your piece. And in fact, you cannot use your abstract as a de facto introduction or a discussion. So basically what your abstract should do is it should introduce your study, tell you what kind of research methods you're following, and explain what your results mean and explain what the implications of the research are. And many journals have a word limit for the abstract, so it's important that you stay within the word limit. And as I told you before, you have to pick your keywords carefully so that your manuscript has and paper have the right visibility with the right kind of audience, and it gets cited, because that's kind of the end goal of where we want to be. I mean, as researchers, I think you should periodically check what your Google Scholar score is, what your Scopus score is, and what your H index is. How many people are reading and citing what you do? And one way to get cited is the quality of journals that you publish in, and also the area. And in order to appeal or to attract readers to your paper, you first want them to read it. And one way to get them to read it is how you pick your keywords and make them broad-based. Next slide. So therefore, how do you write an abstract? Diksha, so I said how not to do it, so therefore we should know how to do it, right? So this is the prescribed format, not just for South Asian Journal of Business Studies, but this is the prescribed format for a lot of Emerald journals. So basically, it is divided into 6 parts. And as I said, these are some of the 6 parts that I discussed in my 5 C's. So one is, what is the purpose of your study, right? So why are you doing the study? And in this case, the one that we are showing you was how do you investigate and articulate the performance appraisal process? Then you need to talk about the design, the methodology, the approach. Are you using secondary data? Are you using an experiment? Are you using a survey? What is the broad geographic region from which your data comes from? Then you have to briefly discuss your findings, right? What is the broad findings? You don't have to go into all the nitty-gritties, but the broad findings. And what are the implications for research in one line, both for theory and for practice? I mean, so does it further research itself, and how is it useful for managers? And why is it original? You cannot just say my research is original because I'm the first person doing it. We all know that nobody is the first person doing any piece of research. So you have to say, how is it that you further existing research, and what is the gap that you're really addressing? And as I told you earlier, keywords. It's very, very important as to how you pick your keywords and present your keywords. So broadly, I'm going to say, before we close the abstract piece of what we're talking about, the abstract is your elevator pitch. So make sure that both in terms of content and in terms of presentation, you follow what the format of the journal requires. Also, you have, and most in what you have to do in your abstract, you have to follow the 5 C's. And you can remember what the 5 C's are, which is common ground, what is the complication, the concern, what is your course of action, and what is your contribution. So those are the 5 C's. And you have to pick your keywords wisely. So that's kind of the takeaway. Make sure you don't just do an introduction and a discussion in your abstract. So the abstract is what really makes a case for why people should read your paper. So having said that, I'm going to move to the next piece of the presentation, which is reconciling references. So I'm going to say when talking about references, like we said, there are 5 C's for writing an abstract. There are 3 R's in the way you think of references. And these 3 R's, I take credit for coming up with these 3 R's. One is you have to use or cite the remarkable research in the area or the seminal pieces of research in a particular area. 2, the second R is research that you cite has to be recent. You cannot say in 1955 somebody said that, and nobody has said anything from 1955 to 2022. There is a continuous stream of research, and you need to sort of follow the thread, and you need to cite what recently people have been talking. So recency is important. And the last is you have to pick pieces that are relevant. You don't just cite willy-nilly research from all over the place. So I'm broadly going to say, when you use references, you have to say, use the remarkable research in the area, recent research, and relevant research, right? So having said that, what makes for relevance? When you're sending papers to a journal, you should look whether the journal has published. And most journals, if your paper is in the scope of the journal, chances are somebody else has written and published a piece in a slightly different, with a slightly different take on the same subject area. So you need to look at the journal to see what is it that what other pieces has the journal published more recently in this area. So what I would suggest is that you look and cite, if you're sending it to, let's say, SAJBS or Journal of Management, you have to cite research from SAJBS or Journal of Management so that they know that this is not the first piece, and you're sort of following a thread of research that has been published in the journal. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the length of the reference list. Nobody is going to be impressed after every sentence if you have 10 references. The way you cite a reference, you cannot just say trust is important for job satisfaction and then have like 20 citations after it. You have to be able to use your references judiciously. So you have to understand the crux of what it is that you're trying to say and use kind of the seminal piece that first came up with that, and the more recent research that has worked further. Ultimately, research is very, very incremental. No one paper is going to change the field. Each of us incrementally change the field by adding little pieces to a broad, sort of, we are building a tapestry really in every field that we work in. So we have to sort of see what is the small area that we are adding to the broad area of research. Because a lot of times when I see papers in which I sort of desk reject, they'll tell me nothing has been done and we are this is a completely new area and we are looking at it, and they'll be looking at direct relationships with like job satisfaction. People have been working for years on a lot of these things. So it is perhaps interesting what you're doing, but you have to figure out what it is that you're doing is new, because nobody wants to review a paper if you're just replicating what's already been done. Even if you're replicating it, and let's say you're replicating it in a new geography, that is interesting, but you have to justify why that is interesting. So the important thing is you need to look at the stream of research that brings you to where you are and therefore justifies your work in a particular area. So in terms of recency of references, what I mean to say is that you try at least 30% of your references should be within the last 5 years. So I look at paper, when I quickly look at the references to see how many papers have they cited that have been written since 2017. Sometimes people take papers from a shelf which has been sitting there for 5 years, so their references are probably 10 to 15 years old. They just dust it off and decide they're going to send it to a journal. It's fine if you plan to do that, but make sure that you update the references and the references are relatively new. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I look at, for example, in our journal, we say that
hasn't added support for that with Siri.
For our journal, we say that the average length of the reference list is about 8,000 to 8,200 words. Now, 30 to 40, you cannot have references which are about 30 to 40% of the entire word count. So you have to rationalize your references. So you make sure that you cannot use every single paper. You pick and choose and use the papers. And a lot of times journals have page limit restrictions. So they say, okay, it cannot be more than 30 pages. And I have authors telling me, no, it's 12,000 words. Everything that I have to say is important. All the authors that I'm citing are very, very important. So there's nothing I can do. So please, can you accommodate? If I accommodate every author that says this, I don't think Emerald is going to take very kindly to me. So we have to be mindful of what the journal's requirements are, and therefore use your reference list judiciously. Make sure that you use recent research, and make sure that, so I'm going to say three things are very, very important. Recent research, try and use some references from the journal that you're submitting to, and also you have to publish seminal research in the area. It's not like you are the first person doing the most important piece of research. In many ways, the reference list tells you what is the genre of research you're coming from to get to where you are. So I think it is important to acknowledge who are some of the other previous scholars that have done important work in the area, which you're acknowledging, and you're saying, okay, we are taking the thread that they have developed and we're moving it on forward. Next slide, please. Diksha, can we go to the next slide? Yes. So one of the things is we are very lazy. Every time typically, one of the things I want to tell you that papers don't get accepted the first time you send it. And I have a big problem convincing many of my South Asian authors that the process through which a paper gets accepted sometimes is long and arduous, and the better the journal is, the harder it is. So you can get rejected after 3 revisions. So you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be willing to leave your ego at the doorstep when you get into the publishing business. So every time you're asked to revise a paper, you change the references. So either the reviewers suggest saying you need to look at this, this, and this, and I think you have to go with an open mind. Sometimes you may not agree with the reviewers, but you have to be willing to give the reviewers you have to take what the reviewers say, because part of getting published is co-opting the reviewers. So you have to make sure you change your reference list. So every time you revise a paper, you need to take away the unused references or the references that you're no longer using and add the new references, because it is important that your reference is always up to date. Many times reviewers say, okay, I'm going to, as the paper is they're reading the paper to review the paper, they say, let me go and check whether the reference is there at the end of the paper. And if the reference is missing, that's one indication that the author is doing a sloppy job, right? So you have to make sure that everything that you can do to convince the reviewer, the editor, that you are very careful about everything that you do, makes them convinced about your results and everything else, because it tells them something about you as a person. So make sure that you reconcile your references every time, delete unused references, add new references, make sure that it is complete. Okay, having said that, next slide, please. So what is the format for the references? One is the American Psychological Association format, and that is the format that is used for most business publications. Typically, you use the author name, the year, and the page number. So I've taken an example with Professor Devasree's publication. So typically, when you have more than 3 authors in a publication, the first time you can use the entire author list, but thereafter you should use et al. In the APA format. So you'll say Devasree et al. 2019. But if you have 2 authors, you're going to use the full author names every time. So you cannot use et al. For 2 authors. Anything for more than 2, you would use et al. Et al. Meaning and others. That's what it means, right? Very seldom do we use the Modern Language Association. It's more for the liberal arts and English. So one little tip that I'm going to give you is if you are planning to do research, I think EndNote is a software where you can store all your references. So as you use references, you can store it in the APA format, and it's very easy to draw or pull it into the paper once you've written it. So it's much easier to reconcile the references using EndNote. So you keep EndNote opened when you write the paper, and then you can sort of adjust your references as you work with the paper. I think that is next slide. I think that's pretty much everything that I have. I'm going to talk very briefly about some key tips for publishing, and then I'll close the presentation. So next slide, please. So I'm going to give you some general publishing tips that you can follow when you write. One is when you send a manuscript to the journal, you make sure it fits the scope of the journal. Use citations or references from the journal and use sort of, as I said to you before, recent, relevant, and remarkable citations. So use citations that are recent, that are seminal, and that are is relevant to your piece of research. Okay. Also make sure you follow the format both for the abstract and the reference list, right? And most journals have guidelines for authors. I tell my students, make sure you read the syllabus. Don't keep coming and asking me. And I think students, in this case of students, we are obliged to make sure, even if they don't read the syllabus, to tell them what they have to do. But journal editors often are fairly strict because they are going through so many manuscripts. So they're just looking for a reason to reject your manuscript. So make sure you follow the journal guidelines when you write. That is the word count. You follow the abstract format and the author non-disclosure. And finally, I think the important thing is you make sure that you introduce your paper and in a cover letter. So the broad takeaway from what I want to say today is through the other sessions, you figured out the body of the paper. But what you are doing with the abstract and the references, with the abstract, you're providing an elevator pitch. And with the references, you're sort of indicating to the reviewers and the readers where it is that you're coming from. What is the stream of research that you're coming from, and what it is that you're adding to the body of research, and what is your contribution to the research. Thank you, folks. If you have any, I'll take any questions that you have and anything else that you might want to add, comments, questions. Thank you very much for being a patient audience.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your wonderful insight on this. Now, we have a few questions so far. What I'm going to do is I will wait at least a minute or two more if there are more questions coming in. Just give it a few more minutes. Now, let's start. So we have 4 questions from one person. Let's start with this. So the first is, if we have 3 or more authors and we are following the APA style of referencing, can we use first author names at all at the first instance that it appears?
My knowledge is that the first time you do the full cite, and then after that you use et al.
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Hello? Yes, now we can hear you, ma'am.
Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, ma'am, I
can't
couldn't
hear.
hear anything.
Okay. So as far
Ma'am,
as
we
I
lost you
know,
again. Oh,
you can't hear me?
oh, I think it's a little bit of a lag. Okay, okay. Ma'am, you can start again.
Okay. From my as far as I know, the first time you cite the full all authors, so let's say you have 3 authors, you cite all authors, and thereafter you can use et al. The big thing is, I think that the common mistake people make is even for 2 authors, they use et al. And for 2 authors, you need to use both the authors throughout the paper. And this is something I learned only 5 years ago. So I'm sharing it so that it's, it's a common mistake that people make, because for 2 authors, we say, okay, for 3 authors, we're using et al. Why not for 2? And for whatever
Now,
reason, APA has this rule.
right. The next question is, what referencing format does Emerald use? And it does not seem to be APA.
So this is something I'm working with Emerald. We have a very inconsistent use of references. So we should use APA. I mean, I don't want to say Emerald, SAJBS. We are trying to use APA, but I think part of it is the journal needs to have a fairly large, checking, editing group to be able to check, for example, to check for spelling mistakes, grammatical errors. And I don't think Emerald has such a strength on the bench to be able to check it as much as, let's say, Sage and Elsevier and some of the other journals. Because I've published in I've published with different publishers. I think Emerald is getting better, and I think we as editors and associate editors are becoming better gatekeepers. I would like to say we'd eventually want to get to the APA style, but we're not quite there yet.
Right. The next question is, should we write abstract after writing the whole paper or before writing the whole paper?
I think the abstract should be the last thing you do. So I think it's once you've written the paper, I think it gives you a sense of what you want to showcase in the abstract. So the abstract really is it's the short form, as I told you, it's the elevator pitch for the paper. So you take the best pieces of the paper and put it all together so that it looks good all together within 100 words. Most journals ask you for like 100 to 150 words. Emerald gives you the 6-part way to do the abstract.
Okay, 1 second. The next question is, how many references should we have? I have a lot of references in the paper that I'm writing. Is it a ground for rejection?
So the ground for rejection is not meeting the word count. So one way to easily cut the word count, so a lot of people send me their structural equation results, which is, I don't really care what your structural equation results are. You create a model which summarizes it. And then one easy way to bring the paper within the word count is to cut references. I'm not saying you should cut the references willy-nilly, but you should sort of cite the seminal pieces in the area and the more recent research, which sort of shows you the research gap in the area. So what is a good, I'd say it's hard to say, give a number, But I'm saying that if your paper is, let's say 8,000 words, as I said, 3,000 of the words cannot be taken up by references. So I'd say you should aim for like 1,200. So I would say like 80 references are good, not 200 references.
Next question is, hello ma'am, is it necessary to cite a paper from the journal in which you want to submit your paper, as in where you want to get it published?
So let me tell, yes, generally I think it's good practice. There was, for example, the British Journal of Management, which is a fairly well-reputed journal. I think it's ranked A in the ABDC list. They used to say that you have to tell us, based on previous papers that we have published, what is it that you're adding? So you have to sort of take the stream of research that they publish. So let's say that you're publishing in strategic alliances. You've got to take the sort of stream of research that they have published recently and said, okay, this paper said this paper did this, and this is the gap, and this is how we're adding to it. So basically, it's good practice. Every time a paper gets rejected and you want to submit it to another journal, redo the reference list and at least include 5 or 6 papers, because you can't say your journal is so irrelevant. You've not published anything that we want to write about. We are writing the first seminal piece that you have to publish in your journal. That just doesn't make sense. So to be respectful of the journal, I think it's good practice to cite. And I think that's something I would encourage across the board. It's really, really important to acknowledge the work that has been published in the journal.
The next question is, ma'am, we use et al. If there are 3 or more authors. Is it wrong?
Correct. That is correct.
That is correct. Okay. Now, the next question, it's tricky, but it says in Thomson, ABDC or Scopus, you know, does, I think they mean an impact factor, because they say that has Thomson Reuters index number, and what is more important?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yes. So they want to know within ABDC, Scopus Journal, or the I think impact factor, which is more important. I think it depends on institution to institution.
No. If you look at JCR, Scopus, and ABDC, right? A lot of journals don't have JCR, don't have a journal citation impact factor score, because they haven't been around as long. It only typically the A and the A star journals in ABDC have an impact factor. So you can say that is most important, but that's a very exclusive list of journals. Yeah. So therefore, most one way that, for example, in the institution that I work in, we get course release based on the quality of journal that you publish, and the quality of journal we look at the ABDC, not so much the Scopus. So we have an algorithm by which we say how impactful your research has been, and for that we look at where it is if you publish in an A star, because many of the A star in ABDC, for example, is on the Financial Times 50 index. So the Financial Times in the UK has published the top 50 journals in business. It's very, very hard to get into. So if you're asking me which is better, the higher a journal is ranked, it's better. All of us would like to get in there, but it's not very easy. So in my entire career, I've published 3 FT50 journal articles. So it's not easy. I published more than 50 articles, but only 3 in FT50. So, and it is becoming harder and harder and harder, because universities all over the world now require publication in good journals. So the competition is insane. So it's not easy. So if you ask me which is better, JCR is the top ranking system, but most universities accept ABDC and Scopus scores.
Now the next question is, I'll combine 2 of them together. Article, which is the A and the, should be counted or not counted in the word limit. Auxiliary and modal verbs should be counted, question mark.
So the way for us, what we do is we take the word, my editorial assistant takes the word count from, I think typically it counts A and all of that in the word count, right? So we just take the word count that we get. So it's not like we are physically sitting and counting the words. And we allow, let's say our word count limit is 8,200. We don't say anything up to 8,250, 8,300. But certainly if it's 11,000 or 12,000, I have a problem because Emerald will come back and tell me you exceeded your word limit in this thing. So because we have a yearly budget in terms of page and word count, because they're publishing it for free, so every journal is allotted a page limit. So that's why it's important. So you can say that your research is so important, I cannot count, reduce it from 12,000 words. Then you have to find some other place to publish it.
Okay. Does it have any impact if we are citing working papers or the paper that have not been published in high-ranking journals?
That's a great question. It depends on the journal, right? So generally you should publish, you should cite that's why I said you have to cite a few seminal papers. I said the remarkable research in the area. Most of the time, I'd say the seminal research is in good journals. Most people would have read it. The problem with citing working papers or obscure papers is others have not read it, and therefore they don't know whether they can verify it. If you say, for example, I'm taking for strategic alliances, the area that I'm working, there are a couple of seminal papers, right? Gulati has written some seminal papers. Das, there are several key authors that you have to cite. Gulati, Das, and Teng. So you have to have cited those papers if you're doing Rothermel, if you're doing research in the area of strategic alliance. And then you can cite more sort of recent research that may not be as well known, and research that's relevant to the area that you're publishing in. You can absolutely cite working papers, but 50% of your citations cannot be working papers. It has to be that you have seminal papers that are relevant to your research, and you can submit some and cite some working papers that might be important, or your own working papers. The one thing I must say is, let's say you have, we recently had an instance in our journal. We had accepted a paper by an author about 6 months ago, and the author had done something slightly different with a dependent variable, but largely had used the same data set. But he or she did not cite the previous paper, which was accepted by the journal. That is an absolute no-no. We figured it out because my associate editor remembered. Why are you so shy you have to cite your own papers if they've been published by the same journal. So you don't have to be so shy or modest about your research. And also don't assume that if you don't tell us, we're not going to find out. We will. So we're not going to think that this is completely new if you just change one variable. So if you've largely used the methodology and the data from a previous research, you have to acknowledge it and cite it. It's very, very important. You cannot be sort of sly about it or shy about it.
Next question. It's very, it says, must the abstract be in italics?
Must the abstract be in italics?
Yeah.
I don't know. It may vary by the journal. I don't know. I don't think it matters. The font doesn't matter because they're going to reset it. The journal will reset it anyway. I think ours is in italics when it's published. I don't think we necessarily have to give it in italics, but they change the font.
For ranked journals in primary data and for ranked journals in primary data analysis, necessary or critical appraisal of metadata is allowed.
So, I mean, you can do, the question you're asking is it, does it always have to be primary data, or can you do meta-analysis, right? This is
Yeah.
not a question for me. This is for the methodology person, but I'll take it anyway. I think that if you do a meta-analysis, it's a different methodology to do a meta-analysis. And I think good journals publish meta-analysis. And I think meta-analysis end up being cited a lot because they're basically summarizing or aggregating the research in an area. Meta-analysis allowed? Absolutely, yes. However, I'm going to add a caveat to it. So for example, if you're sending it to the South Asian Journal of Business Studies, you cannot do a meta-analysis of all papers published. You have to do the South Asia focused empirical papers that have been previously published. So in the case of both bibliometric analysis and meta-analysis, we've had several papers, not several, I'd say at least like 8 to 10 papers I've seen in the last 6 months, which I've rejected because it's a bibliometric analysis of global data anywhere from the globe. So if you're doing a meta-analysis, let's say for a South Asia focused journal such as ours, then the meta-analysis has to have other papers that have focused on South Asia and aggregate those results. So most journals do publish meta-analysis and primary data source papers.
Giving page numbers in references is necessary? I mean, is it?
It doesn't matter because we're counting the word count. Yes, it's generally good to give page numbers. And anyway, the page numbers you give are repaginated by the journal because they publish in a continuous page number in the volume, right? So they starting from issue 1 to issue whatever. It's a continuous page numbering. So yes, I think it's generally good practice because we can quickly see how many pages your paper is. And it's good to have the appendices, the figures, all of them included in the page numbering. And the word count includes all of it.
The next question is, does the sequence of author names matter? Like the first author gets the maximum credit for the research paper and then the credit reduces as further you go down as the author in the sequence.
That's a great question. Couple of things. Typically, papers get cited and remembered by their first author, right? Most of the times, journals, so there are two things. Most of the time, journals require, or the authors, let's say everyone's contribution is equal and there are 4 authors, it's alphabetical. So then and you can say with a footnote that all authors contributed equally to the paper. So let's say that sometimes when the ordering of the authors is not alphabetical, then it clearly says that the first author has contributed more to the paper. So let's say the S comes before the G, and say the last one is a B, the last name. So it's S, G, and B. So for example, I publish with my PhD students, and many times they are the first authors because it's their dissertation, it's their research. I sort of guide them. So I end up being the second or the third author, depending on who else has contributed to the paper. So is it important to be the first author? If it's alphabetical and all of you have contributed equally, you cannot help it. You're not the first author. But let's say you contributed significantly more than the others, then you can sort of override the alphabetical order, and then clearly it is established that you have contributed more. In fact, the paper that I cited from AMR, the person who's the first author is a T. It's Thatcher and somebody, I think. The second author is an S. So there it clearly shows that the first author contributed more. At least I think it is. Yeah, it's Thatcher and Fisher. So is it important being the first author? I'd say yes, if it is not alphabetical. But if it is alphabetical, you can't help where you are. So if you have a last name with Z, you're out of luck because you're always going to be the last author, right? So you have to work with your parents to get a good last name, which starts with A or B.
Now, the next question is it okay to cite local thesis dissertation which were not that much read by the larger community in a paper?
I'd say you cannot base your entire paper on, yes, one or two dissertations you can cite. But that dissertation itself must be based on cited work. So I think it probably is better to rely on that cited work. The only reason you're citing the one hopes the dissertation will be published. So the only reason so I would say generally you would cite the cited work because it's easier to get hold of it if one wants to look at it, because often you want to go and look at where is it, because sometimes people miscite, and often you catch it because you take somebody else's, it's a carryover, you don't read the paper, but you just take the citation from somebody else's paper. And often somebody catches it because if the earlier person has misspoken in the citation, that sort of carries on. So you've got to be careful about what you cite. I'd say dissertations are okay to cite, but I will not rely on citing dissertations as kind of the primary source to make a point.
Next question is, while citing 4 to 5 studies simultaneously, should we follow alphabetical order or we do it chronologically?
Generally, I'd say chronologically. Because I think you have to say what's the most recent study in an area and go. And also, you don't have to go through the entire chronology. You take the seminal and maybe one or two recent. So one of the things I find is for every sentence, you have 10 citations. Then you're ending up with half the paper being citations. It's not necessary to cite 10 papers for everything that you say. And they're not saying anything important. They're not summarizing it. You're just a sentence. We find that trust leads to job satisfaction. Empowerment leads to nothing. You've not said anything about anything. And then you'll cite 10 papers. You've got to say what is the nuance in that paper that you are sort of identifying for us and you're sort of building on. That's very important. One of the big things big problems I have with first-time authors is that I think they find it very hard to summarize papers. You read a paper and you have to be able to say, this is the crux of it. This is the kernel of what we're trying to say. And I think that's an important skill you need to cultivate. You can't just have sort of obvious sentences. Like there'll be no arguments for the hypotheses. You have to be able to make an argument, say why it is the case. And that has to come from your head.
Next question. Okay, someone has written about saying that they want a change in their certificate name. Whoever this person is, could you please message us after all the 8 sessions are over, because this is manual work and it cannot be changed. We can change it once all the sessions are over. This Saturday is the last session. So we'll, after Saturday, please email us the week later. Then all of it can be done in one go rather than doing it in other ones. So because it's just manual work, so you have to give us some time and we'll have to do it after all the sessions are over. Thank you. Now, ma'am, the next question is, what is the difference between principal and corresponding author?
Okay. The principal author is, the corresponding author is the person that submits the paper to the journal, and therefore that person becomes the corresponding author. So for example, typically junior authors tend to be, so let's say I'm working with my PhD student. In this, I mean, most cases when I work with a PhD student, I'm not the first author, but let's say I'm working with my PhD student and I'm the first author, I'm the principal author. But the PhD student sort of submits to the journal, will get the responses from the journal, the reviews will come back to and let's say the PhD student is the second author in this instance, he or she becomes the corresponding author. So the corresponding author is the one that corresponds with the journal. The principal author is the first author. So the first author may not always be the corresponding author. And often you want the corresponding author to be responsive. And one of the, I think this is a good time to make the point. A lot of first-time publishers halfway through the article say, oh, I want to add these two authors to the piece. It's not done. You can't, once a paper is published, you can't say, oh, by the way, I forgot, but I want to add these two people because they were very helpful. If they were helpful, you should have thought of it before the paper got accepted. And the ordering of the authors, before the final acceptance, you've got to be clear about the ordering of the authors. You can't come and say, oh, I want to take out this person. I want to make this person a third author. A lot of these things have to be resolved. Like, let's say you get a conditional accept. That submission will have to resolve everything.
I think we come to an end. We just have a last question now. It says, how many types of research papers are there? Could you briefly explain a conceptual paper?
So there are many kinds of research. So let me take my journal as an example, right? Conceptual paper is basically, it's a theoretical paper without data. We're basically forwarding the research by creating a new theoretical model. We publish very few conceptual papers because conceptual papers are not easy to write. So you take an existing theory, let's say in the West, or which is popularly accepted, and you're adapting the theory to a South Asian context. For whatever, you can say the culture is different, the institutions are different, and therefore we're adapting the theory, and you need to come up with a new theoretical model that looks different than the general theoretical model. It has been, I would say this is perhaps the toughest kind of piece to write because you need to be a very good writer. You have to be very facile with the language, and that's somewhat, I'd say it's a skill that is very cultivated over time. Having said that, empirical pieces are much easier, and there are many kinds of empirical pieces. You can publish empirical pieces from secondary data, you can publish empirical pieces from primary data, you can publish empirical pieces from case-based data, you can publish empirical pieces from experimental data. And so we call it quantitative versus qualitative research. And we get a lot of qualitative research from South Asia, and some of them are very well done. So I think we publish both qualitative and quantitative data, both secondary and primary data. More recently, we've started publishing something called the Executive Insight series, which is basically you do an interview with a CEO, or you look at a phenomenon. For example, we published a piece about COVID response in India. What was so unique about, one of our associate editors was the author. And essentially, he talked about, particularly in Kerala, he used Kerala as a representative example, and he talked about the triple helix model, where the government, industry, and the university worked in tandem to be able to come up with a very quick response. And what are some of the examples of some of the quick responses? So this executive, or you interview a CEO and say how he turned around the company. So I think the current issue has one of the Executive Insight series by a professor from IIM Calcutta, Ramya Venkatramano. So it's basically, I think she talks about Sasken Technologies, which is a company in India, and how the CEO turned the company around. So these are interview-based studies, and they're very short pieces, like 4,000 words, as opposed to the normal 8,200 words. It's a short piece which is sort of interspersed with quotes from the interview, and you sort of use a little bit of theory to bring this sort of the insight to life. So we publish this is particularly keeping SAJBS in mind. We don't publish as many conceptual pieces, and we do empirical and sort of insight series papers.
Next question is, what is a conditional acceptance?
Conditional acceptance is you're almost there, but not quite. You've almost reached the finish line, but you've got just a ways to go. So typically, most journals, including ours, go through, I'd say, 3 to 4 revision cycles. So the first one typically is a major revision. If I mean, one is you can get desk rejected, you can get rejected by reviewers. But if the reviewers decide to give you a chance, they give you a major revision, which is you've got to change a lot of things, data, analysis, writing, so on. Minor revision, we think you're almost there, but you've got to make some changes, right? A conditional accept is, I think you're almost at the finish line, but you still have to also, we say we're going to accept your paper. Even with a minor revision, we don't say we'll accept your paper. But in a conditional accept, we are saying we're almost ready to accept the paper, provided you do this, 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 and this, on the condition that you do this, 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 and this. So a conditional accept is we are giving you our assurance that we'll accept the paper, and we say it's conditional on certain things. Your English doesn't look good in the abstract. Your citations are a bit outdated, something like that. So we'll say specific things which we want you to change. And if you do that, then we'll accept it. And we have very seldom had people that have dropped off from a conditional accept. Whereas from major revisions and minor revisions, people still don't do it because particularly major revisions, very seldom from minor revisions. But yeah. People lose heart when they think they have to change a lot, because one of the general misconceptions is people think that papers will get accepted exactly the way they send it to us. And when I say send back editorial comments, they make the changes and send it back, they think I'm going to accept it. I'm just making sure that it's ready to go out for review. So it's a long haul from there.
Thank you, ma'am. There is a last question that we have. I don't know if you'd like to take it. It says, could you please briefly discuss what is meant by theoretical framework?
This is not my area at all, but I can.
That's the reason I said if you want to take it, you can. Otherwise, we can let it be because
So I'll give like a 2-minute answer. So theoretical framework means that a lot of times when people have a great data set and they have done a fantastic structural equation model and they have some results. So they think they have a paper because they send me the structural equation results and then they explain what all the variables are and the relationships. But the theoretical framework is, where is it that you're coming from? What is the research or what is the story that you're trying to tell? So for example, if you want to explain strategical, I'm going to use my research because for want of anything else. Let's say if you want to use strategic alliances, let's say alliances leads to improved performance, okay, or alliances leads to better product development. Why is it? The theoretical framework is, why is it that it does it? One is you can talk about social exchange. It is because that's one theoretical place where I'm coming from, is it improves the social exchange between the actors. The second theoretical framework is, in terms of transaction costs, it lowers the transaction costs. So I'm using two theories. I'm using the social network theory and I'm using the transaction cost theory. So I'm using those two theoretical frameworks to make a case for why alliances improve product development or performance. So theoretical framework is not just the variables, but what is the broad theory within which your paper sits and makes a contribution. You cannot just explain the 8 variables you have in your paper and say, okay, that is that. It has to sort of sit and it has to tell a story within a context.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation and taking all the questions that were thrown at you today. On behalf of Emerald Publishing, Gulf Medical University, and the Faculty of Management Studies, Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, I extend a very, very hearty vote of thanks to you, Professor Shanthi Gopalakrishnan, Editor-in-Chief of SAJBS, Professor of Management, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Ma'am, it was indeed a very insightful and informative session. where you covered writing an abstract and reconciling references in your manuscript. Last but not the least, definitely the entire audience, thank you so much, everybody who has participated today. Thank you all once again. Now, our last session and the closing ceremony, everything will happen tomorrow. We have on Saturday. So let's meet on Saturday for one last time so that we can put an end to this wonderful series that has been put by, all the institutions together. Thank you, ma'am, once again. I hope you have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, Disha, and thank you, Professor Devashree, for giving the opportunity to do this. I absolutely enjoyed myself, and if people want the slides, you can share the slides with the audience if anybody wants it.
Actually, the entire recording will be shared with everyone, so I'm sure they can always go back and refer. But thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.